The grand chandelier glimmered like liquid gold above the ballroom, scattering light across polished, marble floors where society's most powerful gathered in tailored tuxedos and flowing gowns. It was one of those nights where wealth draped itself across the room like perfume, thick, intoxicating, and almost suffocating. The air hummed with laughter, clinking glasses and the quiet murmur of a string quartet filling the silence between conversations. But near the edges of this opulent scene, sweeping quietly with a mop in hand, stood a man no one seemed to see, except when they needed someone to dismiss. His name was Daniel Carter. To most in the room, he was simply the janitor. The man who picked up the champagne stains, who polished the very marble they stepped across, who cleared away the remnants of their joy when the music faded. But Daniel's story stretched far beyond the mop in his hand. Born and raised in a small southern town, he had known both the sharp sting of poverty and the heavier burden of being judged before ever opening his mouth. Life had pressed him down, stripping him of opportunities, until he found himself working nights to keep the lights on in a one-bedroom apartment that still felt colder than home. That evening, as the guests chattered and mingled, Daniel moved silently, blending into the backdrop of their laughter. He had learned to make himself invisible. It was easier that way. Until a voice, loud and arrogant, cut through the air like a blade. "Hey, you there," called out Richard Bellamy, a billionaire known as much for his fortune as his cruelty. He was tall, sharp-featured, with a smile that never reached his eyes. His reputation was built not only on ruthless business, but on mocking those beneath him. Tonight he was bored, and Daniel had caught his attention. The room went quiet for a moment, heads turning with the same curiosity one might have at watching a lion toying with its prey. Daniel froze, mop in hand, his back straightening instinctively. He looked toward Bellamy, his eyes calm, though his heart beat harder in his chest. Bellamy gestured toward the grand piano in the corner of the ballroom, its black surface gleaming under the light. "Tell you what," he said with a mocking grin, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Play this piano, janitor. Play it like Mozart. And if you do," he paused for effect, letting the crowd lean in, "I'll marry you myself." The room erupted in laughter. The wealthy men slapped each other on the back. Women covered their mouths, eyes sparkling with cruel amusement. To them it was a joke, a way to humiliate the man, who should never have been in their world except with a broom in hand. Daniel's face remained still, but inside every laugh cut deep. He had endured ridicule his entire life, mocked for his skin, for his poverty, for being invisible until someone needed to laugh. He could have walked away. He could have bowed his head, absorbed the cruelty, and retreated into the shadows. That's what they expected of him. But something stirred in his chest, a quiet flame he thought long extinguished. Because once upon a time, long before life had reduced him to mops and midnight shifts, Daniel Carter had been a musician. Not just a musician, but a prodigy. At 12, he had played sonatas with such grace that teachers whispered he would become one of the greatest pianists of his generation. At 15, he had memorized entire concertos, letting his hands move across the keys like water flowing over stone. But poverty had a way of stealing dreams. His mother's illness demanded hospital bills he couldn't pay. His father's absence left him carrying burdens too heavy for a boy. Music had been set aside, replaced with survival. Yet in the deepest part of him, the music never left. It waited, patient, silent, like a bird in a cage longing to fly again. Now, in that ballroom filled with cruel laughter, Daniel's eyes lingered on the piano. His calloused hands tightened around the mop handle before he finally set it aside. He walked forward, not rushing, his steps steady. The laughter quieted into murmurs of curiosity. Some smiled, eager for the spectacle. Others whispered, expecting humiliation. And Bellamy leaned back in his chair, grinning, certain that his little game would end in shame. Daniel reached the piano and paused, resting his fingers lightly on the cool ivory keys. For a moment he closed his eyes. The noise of the ballroom faded, and he was 12 again, sitting in the corner of a church while his mother hummed hymns. He could almost feel her hand on his shoulder, hear her voice telling him, "Play, Danny. Let the world hear what God placed inside you." His fingers moved. The first notes rose into the air, soft, delicate, like whispers in the silence. The crowd stilled instantly. The laughter vanished, replaced by an unfamiliar hush. Daniel's hands flowed across the keys with effortless grace. weaving melodies that shimmered like light on water. The ballroom, once filled with arrogance, now seemed wrapped in something else, something sacred. He didn't play to impress them, nor to silence them. He played because the music had lived too long inside him, waiting for this moment to breathe again. As the piece grew, so did the power. His fingers danced, thundered, soared. The piano sang with a voice too commanding to ignore. Every note carried his story, the poverty, the ridicule, the broken dreams, the resilience. His pain became harmony. His hope became rhythm. And his dignity, long overlooked, became undeniable. Tears welled in the eyes of some who had mocked him moments earlier. Even those accustomed to the world's finest concerts sat stunned, as though hearing music for the first time. And Richard Bellamy, who had started the game with laughter, now sat frozen, his smirk gone, his face pale, his arrogance shattered. When the final note lingered in the air, Daniel lifted his hand slowly, letting silence settle over the room like a curtain. For a moment, no one moved. The ballroom, so used to noise and chatter, stood captive in the echo of a janitor's song. Then, without cue, applause erupted, not polite, not forced, but thunderous, rising from every corner of the hall. People stood to their feet, clapping, cheering, some wiping tears, others shouting, "Bravo!" Daniel bowed his head slightly, his expression calm, though his chest rose and fell with the quiet storm inside him. Bellamy remained seated, his eyes locked on Daniel. He forced a laugh, attempting to recover his composure, but the sound rang hollow. "Well," he muttered, "seems the janitor had a trick up his sleeve." But his voice carried no weight anymore. The power in the room had shifted. No one was laughing with him now. All eyes were on the man at the piano, the man they had mocked, dismissed, ignored. Daniel said nothing. He did not look at Bellamy nor at the others. He simply stepped away from the piano, picked up his mop, and returned to his work. Not out of submission, but out of dignity. He had nothing to prove. The music had spoken louder than words ever could. Yet the night was far from over, because while the applause still echoed in the minds of those present, whispers began to spread. Who was this man? How could a janitor play with the soul of a master? Questions buzzed through the air, and some felt shame heavy on their shoulders, remembering their laughter. But for Daniel Carter, the moment was not about their shock. It was about reclaiming something he thought he had lost forever, his own voice. And that voice had just shaken a billionaire's throne of arrogance. The days following that unforgettable night spread like ripples across a still pond. What began as whispers in the ballroom soon became conversations at breakfast tables, then stories shared in hushed amazement. Guests who had once been amused at a cruel joke now spoke with awe of the janitor who played like Mozart. In the city's elite circles, the tale traveled quickly, part humiliation for Richard Bellamy, part revelation of a hidden genius. But for Daniel Carter, none of that mattered. He returned to his routine, sweeping, mopping, and moving silently through the halls where laughter had once mocked him. To him, the music had been enough. It had been a declaration, not a performance. Yet the world does not so easily forget when truth shakes its walls. One evening, as Daniel prepared to leave after his shift, a woman approached him in the corridor. She was tall, graceful, her face familiar from the ballroom, though softened now by something genuine. She introduced herself as Margaret Reeves, a philanthropist who had spent years funding programs for underprivileged youth. Her eyes held no mockery, only curiosity and respect. "I've heard pianists across Europe," she said quietly, "but none played with the heart you did. Tell me, Mr. Carter, why are you sweeping floors instead of playing on a stage?" Daniel hesitated, his hands tightening around his mop handle. He wanted to tell her of the bills, the poverty, the endless responsibilities that had stolen his dreams. He wanted to tell her that sometimes life doesn't allow second chances, no matter how much talent hides inside you. But he simply said, "Life chose a different road for me." Margaret's eyes softened. "Perhaps it's time you chose one for yourself." She handed him her card, insisting that he call her. Daniel slipped it into his pocket, not knowing if he would. Meanwhile, Bellamy's humiliation festered. The billionaire, once untouchable, had become the subject of ridicule. Newspapers hinted at the incident. Blogs and whispers painted him as a man undone by his own arrogance. But what cut deepest was that his name was now tied to Daniels, a janitor whose dignity had overshadowed his wealth. Bellamy vowed to bury the story, to erase the memory, but the more he tried, the more it spread. Some stories born of truth cannot be silenced. For Daniel, The days became a strange blend of anonymity and recognition. Some colleagues looked at him differently now with quiet admiration. Guests sometimes stopped him, asking if he was the one who played. He answered politely, but he never lingered. Inside, though, the music stirred louder than ever. When he returned home after long shifts, he found himself sitting at the second-hand keyboard he had bought years ago. It was chipped, some keys broken, but it was enough. Night after night he played, sometimes softly, sometimes with thunder, letting the music breathe again. One evening, as he played alone in his apartment, he thought of his mother. He remembered the way she would close her eyes when he played as a boy, the way her tired face would glow with pride. Tears slipped down his cheeks, because in that moment, he realized the piano had never been just about talent or recognition. It had been about carrying her hope, her belief in him, forward. And though she was gone, her voice lingered in every note. Weeks later, Margaret called again. This time, Daniel answered. She invited him to a small gathering, an intimate concert where musicians shared their art not for fame, but for the soul of music itself. At first he resisted, embarrassed by the thought of stepping onto a stage again. But something inside urged him forward. He accepted. The night of the concert, he walked into a modest hall, nothing like the glittering ballroom where his music had first stunned the wealthy. Here the chairs were plain. The audience diverse, students, teachers, workers, dreamers. No chandeliers, no arrogance. Only people gathered to listen. When Daniel sat at the piano, his hands trembled, but only for a moment. Then, with a breath, he let the music flow. The reaction was different this time. There was no shock, no disbelief. Only silence, then tears. Then thunderous applause filled not with surprise, but with recognition. They understood. They felt. Daniel was no longer invisible. In the audience that night was a music professor from the conservatory, who afterward approached him with an offer to teach, to guide, to rebuild the path that had once been stolen from him. For the first time in decades, Daniel saw not just survival ahead of him, but possibility. But not everyone welcomed his rise. Bellamy, still humiliated, tried to dismiss Daniel's gift as a parlor trick. He told anyone who would listen that talent does not erase one's place in society. But the world was shifting, and his words rang hollow. For the more he tried to diminish Daniel, the more people admired him. It was not merely about music, it was about dignity, about the truth that no man, no matter his wealth, has the right to mock another's humanity. Months later, Daniel's story reached beyond the city. Journalists wrote about him, interviews followed. He was invited to play at charity events, then larger stages. Each time, he carried himself with the same quiet humility, never forgetting the janitor's uniform he still wore during the day. For though music gave him wings, his roots remained in the soil of struggle, and he never wished to lose touch with those who still lived unseen. In time, Daniel made a choice. He did not chase fame or fortune, though both knocked on his door. Instead, he used his gift to teach children who, like him, were told their dreams were too expensive, their talent invisible, their worth disposable. He played not for the wealthy, but for those who had been silenced. His music became a voice for the voiceless, a reminder that greatness can bloom in the most unlikely places. And what of Bellamy? He faded, his name no longer commanding respect. For when arrogance is stripped bare, all that remains is emptiness. People remembered him not for his billions, but for the night he mocked a man and lost his power in the echo of a piano. As for Daniel, he carried forward not bitterness but light. He never once mentioned Bellamy's cruelty in his interviews. Instead, he spoke of resilience, of music, of dignity. He reminded the world that we are not defined by the names others call us, nor by the position society assigns us. We are defined by what we carry inside, the fire, the song, the courage to stand when others expect us to bow. And so, the story of the janitor who played like Mozart lived on, not because he shocked the wealthy, not because he silenced laughter, but because he revealed a truth as old as time, that greatness cannot be hidden forever, that dignity once claimed can shake the walls of power, and that sometimes when the world tries to mock you into silence, the most powerful answer is to sit down at the piano and let your soul speak, louder than their laughter ever could. For in the end, Daniel Carter was never just a janitor. He was a man who carried the music of his people, the strength of his struggle, and the beauty of his humanity into every note. And through that music, he proved that true worth is never measured by wealth, but by the power of a soul refusing to be silenced. Years passed, but the memory of that ballroom remained etched into Daniel's soul, not as a wound, but as a turning point. for the man who once swept floors unnoticed was now seen. Not only in his city but across the nation. Invitations flowed in from concert halls, universities, even television studios, but Daniel remained cautious. He understood that the world's attention was fickle. That applause could fade as quickly as it rose. What mattered to him was not the spotlight, but what he did with it. And so he poured his heart into teaching. His evenings, once spent alone at a chipped keyboard, became filled with the laughter and determination of children. Some came from neighborhoods forgotten by the city's wealth. Some carried scars of ridicule and neglect. But all of them carried the same spark Daniel had once carried himself. He told them, "Don't ever let anyone convince you that your worth is measured by what's in your pocket or the color of your skin. Your worth is here." He would place a hand on his chest, and here. Then with a smile, he'd rest his fingers on the piano keys. Slowly, Daniel built something greater than a career. He built a community. What began as a few children, learning in a cramped apartment, grew into a program that filled churches and community centers. Volunteers joined, donations trickled in, and soon he founded a foundation dedicated to providing instruments and lessons to underprivileged youth. They named it the Carter Music Project. And while Daniel never sought recognition, the name carried weight. Parents trusted it. Children aspired to be part of it. One evening, as he sat watching his students perform their very first recital, in a small rented hall, Daniel felt tears well in his eyes. Not because of perfection, the notes were clumsy, fingers missed keys, but because of courage. He saw in them the reflection of himself as a boy, unpolished but full of possibility. Their music was not flawless, but it was free, and that freedom was worth more than applause. Yet despite his growing impact, the shadow of Richard Bellamy never fully disappeared. The billionaire, once at the height of power, had seen his empire weaken. His arrogance had not vanished, but it had lost its sting. Newspapers no longer celebrated him. Business partners grew wary. For when a man's cruelty is exposed, trust crumbles. Still, Bellamy clung to bitterness. On rare occasions, he mocked Daniel in private circles, calling him the piano, janitor, but even those who laughed knew the insult rang hollow. For in truth, the story had reversed. Bellamy was remembered for his cruelty, while Daniel was remembered for his dignity. Years later, an unexpected letter arrived for Daniel. It bore Bellamy's name. Hesitant, Daniel opened it, expecting arrogance, perhaps another attempt at humiliation. But the words surprised him. "Mr. Carter, I have spent years trying to forget that night. I realize now that I was wrong, not only in mocking you, but in failing to see the man before me. I am ill now, and age has stripped me of the arrogance I once carried. I cannot undo the past, but I wanted you to know. Your music has haunted me. For all my wealth, it was your song that I remembered most. Perhaps in some strange way you defeated me. Perhaps you saved me. Richard Bellamy." Daniel sat with the letter in silence. The man who had once tried to reduce him to a joke had, in the end, been reduced to honesty. Daniel did not reply with bitterness. Instead, he wrote back one sentence. Music was never meant to defeat. It was meant to heal. In that moment, Daniel understood something deeper. His music was not just his own. It belonged to every soul who had been mocked, every dream that had been dismissed, every child told they were not enough. His gift was a vessel, carrying dignity where the world had tried to strip it away. As the years turned into decades, Daniel Carter became more than a story. He became a legend. Not for fame, not for wealth, but for the quiet revolution he had started, proving that resilience can turn ridicule into triumph. Journalists called him the janitor who taught the world to listen. Students, now grown, called him teacher, and communities called him hope. In his final years, Daniel no longer sought stages. He spent his time mentoring the next generation of teachers, ensuring the Carter Music Project would live long after him. When asked in an interview what his proudest moment was, he did not speak of the ballroom or the applause that once shook its walls. Instead, he said softly, "My proudest moment is every time a child who thought they were invisible realizes, the world can hear them." And when Daniel finally passed, the world mourned not just the loss of a pianist, but the loss of a man whose life had been a symphony of courage. His funeral was not held in a grand cathedral, but in a community center, filled with children playing music in his honor. They played clumsily, passionately, freely, and as their notes filled the air, it seemed as though Daniel's voice lingered still, whispering through every chord, never bowed a mockery. Never let arrogance silence your song, for your worth is not in their laughter, it is in your music, in your dignity, in your truth. In the end, the story of Daniel Carter was not about a billionaire's cruelty. It was about resilience. It was about how one man, armed with nothing but his music and his dignity, could rise above ridicule to inspire generations. It was about how laughter meant to wound could become applause that healed. And most of all, it was about the power hidden in those society calls invisible, the janitors, the workers, the dreamers, whose light, when finally allowed to shine, can illuminate the world. And so the legend lived on, retold in classrooms, whispered in churches, taught in communities. The story of the janitor who played like Mozart, and in doing so, reminded the world that greatness often hides in the most humble places, waiting for one moment, one song to be set free. Years after Daniel Carter was laid to rest, his music still echoed. Not through recordings alone, though many existed, but through the lives he touched. His foundation had grown far beyond anything he'd imagined. What began as a handful of children in a cramped apartment had expanded into a network of community schools across the country, each one carrying his name, the Carter Music Project. In neighborhoods where dreams had once been silenced by poverty, pianos now stood in classrooms. Children who might never have touched an instrument found their hands dancing across keys, their voices lifted in song. Murals of Daniel, painted with his quiet smile and steady eyes, looked down on them, a reminder that greatness can rise from anywhere, even from a mop bucket in a ballroom. One boy in particular carried Daniel's legacy further than anyone expected. His name was Elijah. He had joined the program at 9 years old, angry at a world that had already told him no too many times. His father was gone, his mother worked 2 jobs, and the streets outside whispered, temptations louder than any teacher's encouragement. But inside the Carter Music Project, Elijah found something different. He found a piano, and through it he found himself. Elijah once said, "When I sit at the piano, I feel like I'm talking to Mr. Carter, even though I never met him." By 16, his talent was undeniable. By 20, he was traveling the world, playing to audiences who rose to their feet in awe. But Elijah never forgot where he began. Each time he stepped onto a stage, he carried Daniel's story with him, reminding the world of the janitor who played like Mozart and changed lives through dignity. The Carter legacy was not just about music, though. It was about justice. Daniel's story became a case study in universities, a sermon in churches, a lesson in classrooms. Teachers spoke of him when discussing resilience. Pastors quoted his quiet defiance as an example of God's grace. Activists pointed to his dignity as a reminder that discrimination can wound but never define. He became more than a man. He became a symbol. And in time, the ballroom itself, the place where his humiliation had turned into triumph, was transformed. Once a playground of the wealthy, it was purchased by donors inspired by Daniel's life and converted into a cultural center. The grand chandelier still hung above the marble floors, but now it glittered above children practicing scales, choirs rehearsing hymns, and artists sharing their gifts. Where laughter had once mocked a janitor, applause now lifted up the next generation. On the wall hung a plaque. "Here a man once turned cruelty into music. Here dignity defeated arrogance. In honor of Daniel Carter." Even Richard Bellamy's name faded from history. His empire crumbled, his wealth dispersed, his arrogance forgotten except as a footnote to Daniel's legend. Scholars who researched the story often found themselves struck not by Bellamy's cruelty, but by how completely he had been erased. "The world remembers the one who was mocked," one historian wrote, "but forgets the one who mocked." That is the final justice of dignity. Generations later, Daniel's descendants still carried his spirit. His niece's grandchildren told their friends proudly, "That's my uncle's name on the school." They never described him as the janitor, only as the man who changed lives with music. In their voices, you could hear both pride and reverence, because his story had become family scripture, and beyond family, his story became heritage. In the wider Black community, Daniel Carter's name joined the list of those who had refused to bow under ridicule. He was spoken of alongside leaders, artists, and dreamers who carved dignity out of oppression. His piano became more than an instrument. It became a metaphor. Teachers told their students, "Find your piano. Whatever your gift is, whatever the world says you cannot do, find it. Play it, let it sing. That is your power." On the anniversary of his birth, Communities held concerts in his honor. Children performed pieces inspired by his life. Elders told the story again and again, reminding the young that laughter meant to wound could always be answered with courage. In these moments, Daniel's presence seemed to linger, not as memory, but as living inspiration. Writers compared him to biblical figures, David before Goliath, Joseph before Pharaoh, those who stood small in stature yet mighty in spirit. Preachers invoked his name when speaking of resilience, drawing parallels between his music and the Psalms of liberation sung by enslaved ancestors in fields. Activists used his story to remind others that dignity is not granted by the oppressor. It is inherent, unshakable, and divine. And yet, what gave Daniel's story such weight was not simply the victory of that night, but the humility of his life. He did not leave the ballroom seeking fame. He did not chase recognition. He returned to his modest world, continued his janitorial work, cared for his family, and lived with quiet grace. He did not need the world to bow to him. He needed only to remain true to himself. That humility made his story not about ego, but about essence. Generations reflected on the paradox. A man who could play like Mozart chose to sweep floors, not because he lacked ambition, but because the doors of society were closed to him. His genius existed in spite of injustice, not because opportunity had been afforded to him. In that paradox lay the most painful truth. How much brilliance the world loses when prejudice blinds it. How many symphonies go unwritten? How many masterpieces remain silent? Daniel Carter's story was not just his triumph. It was a mirror held up to society, showing the cost of arrogance and the poverty of discrimination. Philosophers expanded on this, arguing that Daniel's life embodied the tension between being and recognition. To exist with talent is one thing. To be seen for it is another. Daniel's music was not created for recognition. It was created because it lived inside him. Yet when the world finally heard it, it exposed the injustice of all the years it had been ignored. His story became a reminder that human value does not require validation, but society has a duty to honor it. As centuries turned, Daniel Carter became less of a man and more of a metaphor. His story was invoked when discussing education, urging schools to look beyond grades and appearances to nurture hidden potential. It was invoked in workplaces, reminding leaders never to dismiss the quiet figure in the corner. It was invoked in politics, where movements for equality pointed to him as a symbol of untapped humanity waiting for justice to unlock it. But beyond institutions and speeches, Daniel's story lived most powerfully in the private, unseen corners of life. In the trembling hands of a young boy preparing to play his first recital, whispering to himself, "If Daniel could do it, so can I." In the whispered prayers of a mother telling her daughter, "Never let their laughter define you." In the tears of an old man, sitting alone at a piano, remembering the moment when music first saved him from despair. That is the true immortality of Daniel Carter. Not in monuments, not in textbooks, not in concerts, but in the quiet courage he inspired in ordinary souls. And so the story circles back to that ballroom, to the night when cruelty tried to strip a man of his dignity and instead revealed his greatness. The billionaire who mocked him has long been forgotten. His wealth dissolved, his name erased, his arrogance remembered only as a foil to Daniel's grace. History does not honor those who mock, it honors those who endure. In the end, Daniel Carter's story is not about music at all. It is about the eternal question: how do we respond when the world denies our humanity? Some respond with anger, some collapse in despair. Daniel responded with truth. He responded with beauty. He responded with dignity so profound that centuries later, his echo still shapes the world. Perhaps that is the final lesson his story offers. Dignity cannot be mocked out of existence. Justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied forever. And a single life lived with quiet courage can alter the course of generations. So the world remembers Daniel Carter, not as a janitor, not as a victim of ridicule, but as a symbol of the music that lives inside every human soul, waiting to be heard. His life whispers to us still, "When the world laughs, play your piano. When the world doubts, play your piano. When the world tries to silence you, play your piano. For in those notes lies the essence of freedom. In that music lies the proof of humanity. And in that legacy lies the truth. That dignity, once revealed, can never be forgotten." Generations turned into centuries, yet Daniel Carter's story refused to fade. What began as a cruel dare in a gilded ballroom had grown into a legend told across continents. His life, once confined to a single city, became universal. a melody woven into the human story itself. In Africa, his tale was retold as a modern parable alongside ancient proverbs. In Asia, students studied his resilience in philosophy classes. In Europe, his name was invoked in conversations about art, humanity, and hidden genius. Across the Caribbean, where music had always been the heartbeat of freedom, his legacy was celebrated in festivals where children performed both Mozart and melodies of their own heritage in his honor. Artists painted murals of Daniel Carter at pianos beneath stars, his figure glowing like a saint of sound. Playwrights dramatized his life on stages in London, Lagos, and New York, retelling the story of the night arrogance bowed before dignity. Poets whispered his name in verses about resilience, describing him as a river that flowed quietly until its current could no longer be ignored. In each retelling, details shifted, but the heart remained. A man once mocked revealed the beauty hidden in silence, proving to the world that genius knows no color, no class, no uniform. Philosophers argued that Daniel Carter's story embodied what they called the eternal echo, a phenomenon where certain human acts transcend their moment, vibrating across centuries because they speak to truths greater than themselves. The echo was not just about music, but about the universal hunger to be seen, respected, and valued. Every culture knew what it meant to be dismissed. Every people understood the sting of ridicule. And so every heart resonated with his defiance through melody. In the 22nd century, when artificial intelligence composed most of the world's music, Daniel Carter's compositions, rescued from fragments he left behind, were still played by human hands. There was something unreplicable in them, a tenderness no algorithm could mimic. His pieces became symbolic reminders that music was not only sound, but soul. To play Daniel Carter's works was to commune with his courage. His story also reshaped justice movements globally. Activists in South America invoked him when fighting for workers' rights, holding banners with his name beneath slogans of dignity. In the Middle East, his story was told in mosques and churches as a lesson that arrogance and injustice, no matter how powerful, could be silenced by truth revealed in unexpected places. In classrooms from Toronto to Tokyo, students wrote essays on how his life paralleled their own quiet battles, to be seen in a world often too loud to listen. The Carter Music Project expanded worldwide, now known simply as the Carter Foundation. Its mission had grown beyond music, nurturing voices in art, science, and leadership from communities too often overlooked. Each year, its scholars gathered in a massive global conference, where the phrase, "play your piano," had become both greeting and blessing. Whether one was a singer, a writer, or an engineer, those words carried the same meaning. Let your gift shine, no matter the scorn you face. And through all this, one truth became clear. Daniel Carter was no longer just a story about a black janitor in America. He was a story about humanity itself. His blackness rooted the narrative in the specific scars of racial prejudice, yet his response transcended every boundary. His music spoke the language of dignity that required no translation. Centuries after that night in the ballroom, a statue of Daniel Carter was erected at the United Nations headquarters. He was not depicted as a wealthy man or even as a famous performer. The sculpture showed him in his janitor's uniform, seated at a piano, head bowed, hands poised above the keys. Around the base were inscribed words in many languages. Dignity cannot be mocked. Play your piano. Truth echoes longer than laughter. Every visiting leader, every ambassador, every child on a school trip saw that statue. Some passed by casually, but others paused, staring into the bronze figure's quiet strength, feeling a tug in their spirit. And in that pause, Daniel Carter lived again. Writers of future centuries called him the Mozart of dignity, but those closest to his legacy preferred to call him simply the janitor, not as a diminishment, but as a reminder. Greatness can rise from anywhere. Genius needs no permission. Dignity wears no crown. In the end, Daniel Carter's life became more than a story. It became a compass. A way for humanity to navigate the storms of arrogance, injustice, and prejudice. A reminder that when laughter seeks to diminish, we must answer not with bitterness, but with brilliance. That when the world mocks, we must play our piano. And as long as there were voices silenced, his music would resound. As long as there were children underestimated, his story would inspire. As long as humanity struggled between arrogance and humility, between cruelty and compassion, the eternal echo of Daniel Carter would whisper across the ages. Your worth is not theirs to give. It is yours to live. So play your piano and let the world listen. As centuries gave way to millennia, The story of Daniel Carter passed beyond the boundaries of history and entered the realm of myth. He was no longer spoken of as merely a man who once lived, but as a symbol, an immortal reminder of the power of dignity against scorn, of beauty rising from humiliation. His name traveled through cultures like a thread of light, woven into songs, prayers, and traditions that outlived nations. Children in distant lands learned of him not through textbooks, but through folktales. They heard of a man who carried a mop by day and symphonies in his soul by night. They were told that when he was mocked, he sat at a piano and poured forth music so radiant it silenced cruelty itself. Some versions of the tale described him as visited by angels who taught him celestial melodies. Others imagined that the spirits of enslaved ancestors played through his fingers. Yet in every retelling, the message remained unchanged. Laughter can wound, but truth can heal. Music festivals across the world dedicated moments of silence before performances, a ritual known as the Carter Pause. In those hushed seconds, musicians and audiences alike remembered that every sound carries the weight of human dignity. Then, when the first notes broke the silence, it was as if Daniel's spirit whispered through the keys, reminding them that music was never merely art. It was testimony, defiance, and hope. In time, philosophers described him as part of the eternal chorus of humanity, those rare figures whose lives do not simply touch their own age but reverberate through all ages. Socrates had words, Gandhi had resistance, Mandela had forgiveness, and Daniel Carter had music. Together they formed a timeless choir, each voice teaching the world a different dimension of dignity. His story became deeply rooted in spirituality as well. Churches, temples, and mosques alike invoked him as an example of divine grace, revealed through ordinary lives. Preachers spoke of him alongside prophets, saying, even in a janitor's uniform, the Creator hides genius. Monks in faraway monasteries chanted verses inspired by his resilience. Mystics described his music as the sound of the soul remembering its freedom. And though history preserved his image in bronze and marble, in portraits and murals, the truest memorial remained, the living echo of his courage, in those who carried his story within them. An immigrant girl sitting at a battered piano in a crowded refugee camp whispered his name as she practiced. A young boy in a remote village, mocked for his stutter, remembered him when he stood to speak. An elderly woman, long silenced by a world that overlooked her, smiled when she heard a child say, "Play your piano," in each of them. Daniel Carter breathed again. The Carter Foundation, now spanning continents and centuries, became more than an institution. It became a philosophy. Its motto, "Dignity is the first note," guided not only music education, but movements for justice, equality, and peace. Each generation reinterpreted his story for its own struggles, proving that timeless truths never expire. Even as humanity ventured into the stars, colonizing distant worlds, his name went with them. A space station orbiting Mars held a small piano in its cultural hall, where every year on the anniversary of Daniel's famous performance, astronauts gathered to play Mozart and Carter's own compositions. The music floated weightless through the artificial air, a reminder that even beyond Earth, the story of human dignity had to be carried. Writers of the far future described Daniel Carter as one of the eternal archetypes, and again, I like the hero, the sage, the lover, and the rebel. His archetype was the silenced genius, the one whose power is hidden until cruelty awakens it. His story became a map for anyone facing ridicule: endure, rise, reveal. And yet, amidst all this grandeur, what kept his legacy alive was not the statues, rituals, or ceremonies, but the simplicity of the truth he embodied. That dignity is not earned. That brilliance needs no permission. That the worth of a soul cannot be mocked into silence. One philosopher, centuries later, summed it best. Daniel Carter's music was not merely sound. It was the moment when humanity remembered itself. The moment when arrogance was humbled and the overlooked were exalted. That is why his story will never die. Because it is not his story alone. It is all of ours. And so the echo continued. In laughter turned to silence. In cruelty turned to awe. In every soul who dared to play their piano, whatever that piano may be. Daniel Carter became not only a man of history, but a melody of eternity. His life whispers across ages still. When the world mocks, let your truth sing. When they laugh, let your soul answer. When they doubt, play your piano, and the music will never die. Stories end, but legacies do not. The tale of Daniel Carter began with laughter, yet it concludes with silence, not the silence of scorn, but the silence of reverence. What began in a single ballroom now lives across centuries, across nations, across hearts. And in that journey, Daniel Carter ceased to be merely a man. He became a truth. It is easy when hearing his story to imagine that night as the climax. The janitor mocked. The piano played, the crowd silenced. But the true ending was not in that moment. The true ending is still unfolding. Wherever people take his lesson into their own lives. For every time someone refuses to bow before ridicule, Daniel's fingers move again. For every child who dares to show their gift, even when mocked, his music swells once more. His ending is not in the past. It is in the courage of each new generation. We live in a world that often forgets the quiet, the overlooked, the underestimated. Yet Daniel's life insists that greatness often hides in plain sight. That genius sweeps floors as well as concert halls. The dignity wears uniforms as well as crowns. His story reminds us that the measure of humanity is not in wealth, status, or applause, but in the unshakable truth of the soul. The billionaire who mocked him that night was long ago erased by time. His fortune could not preserve him. His arrogance could not immortalize him. His laughter is gone, swallowed by the silence Daniel created. And perhaps that is the greatest irony. The man who mocked is forgotten, while the man he mocked lives forever. History chooses not arrogance but dignity. And so, the final chapter of Daniel Carter's life is not about music, but about us, about the world we choose to build when we remember him. Do we laugh at those we believe beneath us, or do we listen for the music inside them? Do we close doors or do we open pianos? Do we measure a person by their wealth or by their worth? These are the questions his story leaves us, unanswered but urgent. In one of the last surviving writings attributed to Daniel himself, found in a tattered notebook after his death, he had scribbled a single line. I did not play to silence them. I played to remind myself who I am. That sentence, fragile and fading, holds the essence of his story. He was never performing for their approval. He was reclaiming his own dignity, refusing to let their laughter define him. And in doing so, he gave the world something far greater than music. He gave the world a mirror. Today, whenever someone says, play your piano, they do not mean only music. They mean stand in your truth. Rise in your dignity. Refuse to be mocked into silence. Let your gift, whatever it is, speak louder than the laughter against you. That is the eternal inheritance Daniel Carter leaves us. And so, as the curtain falls on this story, imagine once more that ballroom. Imagine the chandeliers glittering, the wealthy crowd roaring with cruel laughter. Then imagine the janitor sitting quietly at the piano, fingers trembling for a moment before they find their strength. And then the music, pure, undeniable, transcendent. The room falls silent not because he demanded it, but because truth needs no permission. That image is where Daniel Carter will live forever. In that moment of transformation, in that moment when laughter turned to awe, when arrogance turned to humility, when invisibility turned to immortality, and as long as there are people to remember, his music will play on. Not only in concert halls or classrooms, not only in statues or stories, but in the beating hearts of all who have ever been mocked, overlooked, or silenced. For they will remember Daniel Carter and know, dignity cannot be destroyed. Genius cannot be erased. Humanity cannot be mocked out of existence. The story ends here, but its echo continues. And if you listen closely, in the quiet between heartbeats, in the silence after cruelty, in the pause before courage, you may still hear it. The sound of Daniel Carter playing his piano. Forever.